think on a personal level, we're quite friendly. We have lots in common in terms of culture, food, all of that. But in terms of the war, we actually asked that question to a number of people in Japan and China, and many people said that they try not to talk about the war because it often makes things quite awkward. So what Hainin and I had to go through for 2 weeks, forced to talk about the war all the time, was quite tricky.
I mean, how much of a journey was that for you, travelling to Japan, hearing things that were quite confrontational, I imagine?
It was my first trip to Japan, so thinking back now, I wish I was on that trip for a different purpose. So my impressions could be very different from now.
Was it harder than you thought it would be?
It was much harder than I expected, because we spent the first 2 days, speaking to quite a number of nationalists, right-wing nationalists, who felt quite strongly about, changing the way the history has been taught in Japan. So it was a harsh beginning.
I mean, let me take you back then to your childhoods. Mariko, what did you learn about what Japan did during the war when you were growing up?
So I was in Japan. I was raised in Japan until the age of 16. So I first learned about Japan's world history when I was 14. And you go through from human evolution to today in 1 year. So I was quite interested in war history because I had a grandfather who was very opinionated about the war. But I remember thinking, okay, we just spent 2 lessons on the entire war. And, 14 years old, you're more interested in fashion and boys. How are you supposed to remember all of that? So after that, I traveled across Asia, visited war museums, and really strongly felt that what I learned at school wasn't enough. So I wrote an article about it, which became very, very controversial in Japan because obviously people thought that I was criticizing about my own country in front of global audience.
Japan has, though, apologised to China many times. That's known, of course, and there's been all this Japanese financial aid, $36 billion to China. Is that something, though, that the Chinese people recognise, or is their interpretation different as well?
I think there are a number of Chinese people are aware of the apologies from some of the Japanese politicians occasionally, and the financial aid during a certain period of time. Nevertheless, it was not taught in our history textbooks, that's for one thing, but people still have channels to learn about that part of history. But saying that, the thing that people tend to, we can see some kind of protests, in 26 and 2012, and people say, why are you still so angry after Japan has been apologized? The thing is, there is a lack of a consistency in the acts and the words from Japanese politicians in particular. When you apologize, today and went to the Yasukuni to pay respect to the war dead or war criminals, it kind of destroyed the trust or the very, weak foundation of, having a conversation between the Chinese public and the Japanese public. And that's something I think we need to talk about, in terms of communications.
And also, Mariko, even the historic facts are in dispute here. I mean, what happened in Nanjing, the 2 countries can't agree.
Indeed. I mean, we did speak to a number of people who said that all those supposedly civilians were just guerrilla fighters who dressed as civilians. Even a little bit more moderate historian would argue that there were only 200,000 people in the city of Nanjing. So how could China claim that more than 300 were killed? And also the Communist Party, just after the war, even during the war, when they were bringing this issue up, they were citing a lot lower numbers. So there are a lot of controversies there.
But Haining, how did it feel to be sitting there and to be told by some Japanese people that this is all wrong, that what happened in Nanjing simply didn't happen that way?
I think when you think about whether those nationalists would talk to you in that way, and when you're actually in that position, it was quite different. I think it's the one thing that we have some debates about exact numbers of casualties during the Nanjing massacre. It is another when someone's saying in your face that it should not be called a massacre in the first place, it should be called an incident, and trying to play it down. And that's kind of the thing that will provoke the deepest emotions on the back of your mind as a Chinese person.
Do you think that today's Japanese population should now be feeling guilt over what happened?
Can you repeat that question?
Do you think that, Mariko, that other young Japanese should feel guilty about what happened?
I don't think Japanese people, ordinary people, should, feel guilty about what the soldiers and the politicians did some 80 years ago. That's a different question. However, for politicians, it is important for politicians, including the Prime Minister, to recognize that they need to face the history, with the honesty and with a very sincere attitude and consistency in their actions and words towards their neighboring countries and the people in those neighboring countries.
Marika, what are your emotions at these times? Not only being at home in Japan, but when you went to China as well, did you feel a sense of guilt for what the people of your country once did, or do you dispute what happened? Just take us through how you felt over this time.
Well, I actually visited Nanjing as a tourist. It sounds a little bit odd, but I was so interested that I had to see the evidence myself. And what I felt there was, firstly, very vulnerable. I didn't want people to find out I was Japanese, so I was thinking I'll pretend I was Korean if anyone asked, because all the evidence was so overwhelming. And even though I knew some of the arguments that some of the photographs might be fabricated and whatnot, but there was a section in the museum where Japanese soldiers were speaking to a Japanese journalist, admitting that he killed and raped. And that's when I thought, it's not about the number. Something horrible did happen. But this project was quite interesting in a sense that I started off criticizing our own education, but we also examined if China's patriotic education plays a role in today's tensions between the two countries. Heini mentioned about apologies not really taught at school, but also whether that sentiment against Japan, has it been played up in anti-Japanese war dramas on TV? So it was a difficult, even watching those dramas, even though you think that, okay, maybe people won't take this seriously, but all those emotions for 2 weeks was quite a challenging experience.
And what do you think now in terms of at a political level? Shinzo Abe, once again, going to the Yasukuni Shrine. Every year we see Japanese politicians visit, but it is quite a political statement.
Indeed. I actually, as part of the program, I actually went there with my own grandfather because his uncle is among the war dead who is enshrined there. And I felt so torn because, the Prime Minister, whether you believe him or not, he would say that he's there for the war dead, the 2.5 million Japanese soldiers, not the war criminals. My grandfather felt very strongly that he wanted to go with me to pay respect to his uncle. So I can understand that emotions, but at the same time, I could completely understand why that would provoke very strong reactions in China.
Heini, we have these pictures and these incidences of protests over the East China Sea. This is really hotting up. It's been going on for some time now. Given that, do you see things improving between the two countries in the years ahead?
I have to say I've become less optimistic after doing this project than I did before doing it, because I was growing up with a quite favorable attitude towards Japan in 1980s, 1990s. We were quite, familiar with Japanese pop culture, so it's quite a pleasant feeling towards that country. But after this trip, I realized the gap of understanding between the two countries, between politicians and public, are much deeper than I ever thought. So I'm not 100% optimistic about the future between these two countries in terms of political tensions. However, I think between the publics, between the younger generations, there's still a chance because we have these cultural similarities between each other. But the starting point that we both need to dig into the history and face the truth, the fact happening in history, both in China and Japan. And that's a starting point for mutual understanding. And that's exactly what we have been trying to do.